All right, today we're going to look at lesson 9.3, and we are going to do some more solving of quadratic equations. Now, 9.2, if you did your flipped classroom last night, you started solving quadratic equations by graphing. So let's just review a few things before we get into today's lesson. Okay, first of all, a quadratic equation. If we graph a quadratic equation, what does that graph look like? What's it called? What's the graph called? A parabola. Very good. So when you were graphing and solving these equations last night, what were you looking for? When you were looking for how many solutions an equation had, what were you looking for when you graphed it? Okay, what kind of point? Give me more information. Do what? Okay, but what were those ordered pairs? What were the points that you were looking for? There you go. You were looking for where that parabola crossed the x-axis. So you were looking for the x-intercepts. Now, if the parabola crossed the x-axis twice, how many solutions or answers did you have? 2. Very good. If the parabola crossed the x-axis one time, how many answers did you have? 1. And if it never touched the x-axis at all, how many solutions did you have? None. All right, awesome. But what do we do if we're not going to graph the quadratic equation, but we still want to be able to solve and find our solutions? Well, that's where we're going to look at today, solving quadratic equations using square roots. Now, the essential question says, how can you determine the number of solutions of a quadratic equation of the form ax squared plus c equals 0? Now, you're going to notice there is an x squared term and there is a constant term. All right, we're not looking at a full-blown trinomial that can be factored. In these problems, we are going to have our x squared term and possibly a constant. All right, so let's review a couple things and learn a couple things about square roots. All real numbers have 2 square roots. Now, you haven't really looked at that yet, okay? But let me prove it to you. We all know that the square root of 25 is what? 5. Okay, awesome. But did you know that the square root of 25 is also negative 5? Yes. Okay, let me prove it to you. What is 5 squared, or 5 times 5? 25. And what is negative 5 squared, or negative 5 times negative 5? 25. So, positive 5 and negative 5 are both square roots of 25. So that proves all real numbers have 2 square roots. One will be positive and one will be negative. Now, the symbol we shouldn't have any trouble with. We've seen that symbol over and over and over again. But I do want to point something out, and I want us to add something to our notes. Okay? How do we read this problem right here? The square root of 9, right? It's the square root of 9. But here's what I want you to understand, because this is what we did in 9.1. Every single problem I gave you in 9.1 started with a radical over it, correct? So, you weren't wrong when you only gave me the positive answer, because when the radical is in the original problem, here's what they're asking for. They're asking for the positive square root. The positive square root of 9. Okay, so I want you to write that down, because I need you to understand when the radical is in the original problem, they are asking for the positive square root. They don't want them both. They want just the positive square root of 9. All right? Then, of course, a radical expression, we learned in 9.1, is a problem with a radical sign in it. Now, how do we read square roots, and how do we find possible solutions without graphing? Well, let's read our square roots. Who is brave enough to raise their hand and read letter A? Awesome. Travis?
Square root of 9.
Perfect. Square root of 9. That one's not a big deal. We've seen that one a lot. Letter B. Loza? All right, I hear negative square root of 9, and I'm okay with it, but really this is the opposite of the square root of 9, okay, is another way that we read this. The opposite of the square root of 9. Well, let's talk through that. What is the square root of 9? Everybody. 3. And what is the opposite of 3? Negative 3. So it's the opposite square root of 9, but I'm okay with negative square root of 9. All right, what about letter C? Now, we haven't seen this one before, so is there anybody brave enough to try? All right, Blake.
Positive or negative?
Keep going.
Square root of 9.
Do I look shocked? I'm shocked, but I'm proud of you. That's awesome. Okay, that's exactly how you read it. It's positive or negative square root of 9. Now, if you don't know that, write it down, because that's not something that you've seen. at least with me. So if you're not sure how to read it, let's write it down. It's positive or negative square root of 9. Okay, positive or negative is how we would read that. So add that into your notes. Very good, Blake. I'm proud of you. All right, letter D. Who can read letter D for me? Somebody new. I've got the same hands up in the air. I'm going to just pick on somebody. Malcolm. How do we read it? The square root of negative 9. Awesome. Now, let me ask you this. Are we able to solve the square root of negative 9? There's a negative under the radical. Is that okay?
No.
Sometimes, but not when it's the square root of negative 9. Okay? So, when is it okay to have a negative under the radical? What did we learn? When is it okay? As long as the root is odd, a negative under the radical is okay. But when it's the square root of a negative number, we're not going to be able to solve it. So keep that in mind because we're going to see that come up later in the lesson. All right, now, I forgot. Let's go back. Possible solutions. All right, grab those highlighters because we're going to highlight a couple of things. When D is greater than 0, okay, in the equation x squared equals D. Now, I want you to notice what we're talking about. When x squared is isolated and it's all by itself. So you see in all three of these that x squared is by itself. So when x squared is by itself and it's set equal to these values, look what happens. When the value is greater than 0, your problem has two real solutions. So just by looking at the problem, I'm going to be able to tell how many answers I'm supposed to have. What happens when D equals 0? When x squared is set equal to 0, there's one real solution. And then when D is less than 0, what kind of numbers are less than 0? Negative numbers. So anytime your x squared is isolated and set equal to a negative number, there are no solutions. All right, so here's what I want you to highlight. I want you to highlight D is greater than 0, D is equal to 0, and D is less than 0. And then I want you to highlight 2, 1, and no. Okay, that way it sticks out. When D is greater than 0, there's two solutions. When D is equal to 0, there's one. And when D is less than 0, there's no solutions. All right, so we're going to use that chart here in just a minute. So don't let it get too far from your brain. All right, now, example number 1. It says solve the equation using square roots. Now, we have been solving equations since day 1. What is our goal when we're solving equations? What's our goal?
Set it equal to 0.
No, not necessarily set. We don't always have to set equal to 0, but we're thinking, what are we always trying to do with the variable when we're trying to solve an equation? Do you say that again?
Find the variable.
The variable is usually given to us. Somebody else. Always trying to get the variable by itself. So we're going to start these problems by getting the x squared by itself, okay? But we're not going to be finished because we want to know what just x equals. So we're going to learn how to do that. Now, go ahead and highlight the statement that's underneath the instructions, and we're going to come back to it in just a minute. It's not super important right here at the beginning, but we'll come back to it in just a minute. All right? Now look at letter A. Remember, this is a simple equation. We move things with inverse operations. Right now, we're just trying to get x squared by itself. So Xander, what do I need to move so that x squared will be by itself? -3. And how am I going to move it to the other side?
Divide.
I'm going to divide it. So we're going to divide both sides by -3. So we know -3 divided by -3 is 1. So we can cross those out and just bring down x squared equals. What is -75 divided by -3? What is it?
15.
Try again.
If not,
That's 3/4. So divide 3/4 by 3 and we get 25. Awesome. Okay. Now, before we go any further, let's look at what we have and let's look at that chart that we just talked about. If x squared is isolated and it is set equal to 25, that's a number greater than 0. So how many solutions should this problem have by the time we're done? It should have 2, right? According to our chart, when x squared is equal to a number greater than 0, there's 2 solutions. So let's see if by the end we end up with 2 solutions. Now we're not done. We said this earlier. We're not done until x is by itself. Right now, x squared is by itself. So here's the next question I have for you. How do we undo something that has been squared? Because the x is squared, we need to undo that. So how do we undo something that has been squared? Square root it. Very good. So we are going to take the square root, because what we do to one side, we must do to the other. So we're going to square root, or take the square root of both sides. Now, here's where that statement comes in. Ready? Let's look at it. If you put the radical into the problem, don't forget to give both answers. So let's look back at the original problem. Was there a radical in the problem when we started? No. We put the radical into the problem. So we also have to put plus or minus into the problem. That's how we're going to give both answers. So if we put the radical into the problem, we also put the plus or minus into the problem. Now, what is the square root of x squared? X, and it equals plus or minus. What's the square root of 25? 5. Now, how many answers do we have right there?
2.
What are they?
Positive
5 and negative 5. So remember back here when we said there should be 2 answers at the end? That's exactly what we've ended up with. We've ended up with positive 5 and negative 5. Now, you can separate those and say x equals 5 and x equals negative 5. I'm okay if you leave it like this. As long as you understand there are 2 numbers right there. There are 2 solutions when you have that plus or minus sign. All right? Okay, I want you guys to work with your table on letter B. Take about 60 seconds and work letter B. What did you guys do first on letter B? All right, we're going to move the 15 to the other side, which means we're going to have to add it. So we bring down the 4x squared, and it equals, what is negative 15 plus 15? 0. Very good. All right. Carson, how do we get x squared by itself?
Divide by 4.
Good. We're going to divide both sides by 4. And so x squared equals 0. Great. Now, if x squared is equal to 0, according to our chart, how many answers should we end up with? 1 answer. All right, so let's see if that happens at the end. How do we undo the x squared? Take the square root of both sides. Now, we put the radical into the problem, so what else do we have to put into the problem? Positive and negative. Positive or negative. Okay, so what's the square root of x squared? X, and it equals plus or minus the square root of 0. What is the square root of 0? 0. All right, if you're not sure, put it in your calculator. It'll come out to say 0. However, is there any such thing as a positive or a negative 0? No. So in this case, we are going to erase the positive or negative, and we are just going to have x equals 0. Now, is that the one answer?
Yes.
And isn't that what we said we should have?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right, but I just wanted you, we still want to get in the habit. If we plug the square root in, we plug in the plus or minus. Okay, but sometimes we'll end up taking it away. Now, look at letter C. And this one looks different than anything we've done before. So I want to hear, but I want you to raise your hand. I want to hear what you think we would do on this problem first. Okay, I want to see a hand, and I want you to tell me what you think we would do. Caleb. Okay, that's what I've heard all day. I've heard distribute, which is fine, except for the fact that before you distribute, you would have to work that shortcut out, and then you would have to distribute, and that's a whole lot of extra work that we don't want to do. Okay, but that's okay because that's everyone's first initial reaction. Does anybody have a different idea? Nate?
Square everything inside.
We can't do that. No, that's extra work. We don't want to do that. We can do it, but we don't want to. That's extra work. Okay? Travis.
The little shortcut thingy where you have to do the first term in the middle.
Right, but that, again, that's us working out and doing way more work than we have to. All right, so let me offer you this. Why can't we just go ahead and move the 4 to the other side? If we are trying to isolate the x squared, or the squared part of the problem, why can't we just go ahead and move 4? How would we move 4 to the other side? But are they adding it?
Divide.
They are multiplying it, so we're going to have to divide it. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So we're going to divide both sides by 4. Now, we know it cancels over here because it equals 1, and we just bring down the x minus 3 squared equals, and we're just going to keep that as 9/4. All right, it's reduced. It's improper, so leave it alone for right now. Now, we've got the squared part of the problem by itself. And normally, yes, it's x squared, but what are we going to do at this point? We're going to undo the squared part again. So how do I undo the squared part of this problem? Square root, right? Nothing has changed. It's just we have a binomial that has been squared instead of just an x. So we are going to take the square root of both sides. Now, we put the radical into the problem, so what else goes into the problem? Plus and minus. Perfect. Now, what do you think happens on the left? What do you think the square root of x minus 3 squared equals?
X minus 3.
X minus 3. Very good. If the square root of x squared is just x, then the square root of x minus 3 squared is just x minus 3. And it equals plus or minus. Now, there's a fraction under that radical. And what did we learn to do when there's a fraction under the radical? Let's separate it, just so our brains can see. That is the square root of 9 divided by the square root of 4. What is the square root of 9? 3. And what is the square root of 4? Awesome. Now, we're not done, though, because x is not by itself, and we need x by itself. So, Deslin, what are we going to do to get x by itself? We're going to add 3 to both sides. Perfect. Now, we have plus or minus or positive or negative 3 halves plus 3. What are we doing?
You gotta make it a mix now.
Loza, let me hear what you think we're going to do. You can. Okay, that's fine. If you want to separate the positive and the negative, go for it. All right. That is the key, though. Understanding that is a positive 3 halves plus 3, and that is a negative 3 halves plus 3. So you're going to have to work out 2 separate problems. All right. Pick one. Let's do the positive 3 halves plus 3 first. Grab your calculators if you need to, and tell me what is 3 halves plus 3 equal to? 9 halves. So x equals 9 halves, and we're going to box it in. Again, we're just going to leave it improper. It's reduced, so leave it as 9 halves. Okay? Now, we have a second answer. We have to now go back and do negative 3 halves plus 3. So grab your calculators and tell me what you get when you do negative 3 halves plus 3. Is it 3 halves? 3 halves. And then we box in our second answer. Now, here's what I want you to do with your highlighter. I want you to highlight the little plus or minus sign right here. And then I want you to highlight your 2 separate answers. Because I need you to understand if it's plus or minus, you have 2 problems, 2 different answers that you have to get. Go ahead and work letter D with the people at your table. What did you guys do first on letter D? We got to move that 12 and we're going to subtract it from both sides. Awesome. So we've got x squared equals, what's 10 minus 12? Negative 2. Now, by a show of hands, how many of you kept going? Okay. By a show of hands, how many of you didn't keep going? Okay. By a show of hands, how many of you stopped because you knew you needed to? How many of you stopped because you didn't know what else to do? Why did you stop? For those of you that stopped, why did you stop? Didn't know what else to do. Okay. All right. Loza, why did you stop? All right. There's no reason to go any further because look at the chart from the very beginning of class. Okay. X squared is isolated. X squared is equal to a number less than 0. And what did we learn? If our value is less than 0, then how many solutions will it have? No solution. So it's not even necessary for you to take the square root of both sides. Okay. Hopefully if you did, you recognized right away there was a negative under the radical and you couldn't do anything. Okay. But if you can recognize sooner, you'll save yourself some work. If x squared is equal to any negative number, we're done. It's no solution. Okay. Example number 2. This is our last example. It says solve the equation using square roots and notice the rest of the directions. It says round your solutions to the nearest hundredth, which means we're going to have what kind of answers this time? Decimals. All right. This is when you can give me decimal answers when it tells us to round. Jamara, if they want us to round to the nearest hundredth, how many decimal places is that? Very good. 2. So everything else is the same. We're going to isolate x squared. Then we're going to take the square root of both sides. We're just going to give our answers as decimals. So look at letter A. What would we do first? Subtract 8. Perfect. So we're going to subtract 8 from both sides. X squared equals, what's 19 minus 8? 11. All right. Where do we go from here? Square root both sides. We put the radical into the problem. What else has to go into the problem? Positive negative sign. All right. What's the square root of x squared? X, and it equals plus or minus. Grab those calculators.
3.
And tell me what the square root of 11 is, rounded to the nearest hundredth.
3.32.
Now, I believe in the calculator it's a 3-1, but what's after the 1?
A 6.
So just as a mini review, if the number is higher, 5 or higher, it rounds up. So 3.32 would definitely be your final answer. Again, you can say x equals positive 3 and 32 hundredths, and then x equals negative 3 and 32 hundredths, or you can leave it just like this. All right, let's look at letter B. What do I do first? Add 2. Very good. I'm going to add 2 to both sides. So 5x squared equals 2. What do I do next? Blake, what do I do next?
Divide 5 by both sides.
Very good. Divide both sides by 5. So x squared equals 2/5. How do I get rid of the x squared?
Take the square root.
Good. I'm going to square root both sides. I put the radical in. What else has to go in? Positive, negative. What is the square root of x squared? And it equals positive or negative. Now, put that in your calculator. Again, we're rounding to the nearest hundredth. So there's no reason to separate it. You can literally plug it into your calculator just like it is. What is the square root of 2/5? 0.63. Again, you can leave it just like this. And that is 9.3.